Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our August 26th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features a conversation with Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johson about the current state of the farm economy and the pressing need for a new farm bill. But before we get to that conversation, I have my colleague, Zach Bader, here in the studio to discuss some new research Iowa Farm Bureau released over the summer that explores how Iowans feel about their food and the farmers who provide it. Zach, thanks for joining us here today.
You bet. Glad to be back.
You know, this is some really interesting information, and I know we've had a few years now of data to be able to analyze and look at. So I think this is a really valuable conversation for our members.
Absolutely. You know, we've been doing this survey for 11 years, and there's always interesting things that come out, and this year is definitely no exception.
So the research we're sharing today is something that we do annually. But for those who aren't familiar, can you give us a little background?
Yeah, so the Iowa Farm Bureau Food and Farm Index, as you know, Andrew, like I said, we've been doing this survey for the last 11 years. We've been doing it with the Harris poll, and it's a survey of Iowa grocery shoppers between the ages of 20 and 60, and we look at 500 Iowa grocery shoppers that we're surveying there. And what we're looking for is those primary decision makers, right? We want people who have that primary grocery shopping responsibility in the household. And the time frame that we actually ran that survey was from late May to early June of this year. And so we're asking them questions like, how often does your family consume meat and dairy? Do you think that those products are healthy? How do you feel about imitation products? We're also asking them, who do you trust when it comes to more information about the nutrition or safety of your food? Which sources are you using to learn more about your food and farming? We're also asking the question, do you trust farmers? And then after we ask that question, we're providing them with some additional facts about how farmers care for their animals and the environment. And then we're asking them, do those new facts change your perspective on that?
Yeah, very important and timely topics for sure. And of course, this information is really valuable to our Farm Bureau team as we're working to tell farmers' stories. It's also valuable to our farmer members who want to know where they stand with Iowans and how they can make a meaningful connection with those folks. For me, a big takeaway was the trust that Iowans place in Iowa farmers. I think that tells a great story on the amount of trust that farmers have earned and the efforts that they've taken. So there's certainly value to sharing our story and talking about what farmers are doing today, how they're raising that food, and the unique nutritional value, which I think segues right into another takeaway from this year's survey, is that when consumers learn more about food production practices and conservation efforts, it instills confidence and increases their likelihood to consume and purchase those products. What are some things that stood out for you, Zach?
Yeah, I would definitely echo those takeaways for sure. For me, it kind of falls into three different buckets. And the first of those buckets is price. And it's not going to be surprising to anyone to find out that price has always been an important factor for people who are making purchases of meat, milk, and eggs. In fact, price, taste, and freshness are always among the top three factors as long as we've been doing this survey. But we are really seeing in these last two surveys an increased emphasis on price. For example, 81% of shoppers say that they're concerned about regulation that increases food costs, and that's up 4% from last year's survey, and it's actually up 19% from 3 years ago.
That really jumped out to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge increase. So price has always been important, but now has taken on that increased importance in these last couple of years. The second bucket that I would throw out there is that despite this price sensitivity that consumers are feeling right now, we can also see that their enthusiasm for real meat and dairy remains high. You've got 99% of Iowa households that are consuming these products at least weekly, and that corresponds with how they feel about those products. You've got 94% saying that meat from animals is healthy, and 92% saying the same thing about dairy. And as you mentioned there earlier, Andrew, when they learn more, they're likely to consume more of those products. So when we let them know that these real products include high-quality protein, vitamin B12, zinc, iron, when they understand the nutrition of those products, the likelihood of them consuming those products or consuming more of those products goes up, and we see that in the survey. And the third bucket that I would just highlight here is that, as you said, the trust in farmers remains high. And this is something, again, that's consistent that we've seen over the last 11 years. And this year we saw that 93% of Iowans say that they trust farmers. And it's always amazing to our researchers. It's amazing to us as well. We know that farmers are well regarded in the state, but it's especially amazing to our researchers at the Harris Poll who say that they're not seeing this with other industries and other institutions. Obviously, trust across the landscape is kind of lacking a little bit right now. So it says a lot about the relationship that Iowans have with farmers that 93% say that they trust farmers. And then again, alluding to something that you said earlier, that trust and that confidence grows as they learn more. So they're even more confident when they learn things like the fact that Iowa farmers rank number one in several different conservation practices, like water quality wetlands, conservation tillage, buffer strips. That confidence only grows. So similar to how they're going to consume more meat and dairy when they learn about the nutrition of those products, they're even more confident in farmers after learning about the things that those farmers are doing to protect the environment.
Yeah, I would agree. As we mentioned earlier, we also surveyed Iowans' thoughts on plant-based imitation meat and milk. What did we see there?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing through this survey is that some of that early curiosity in imitations is waning a bit. You've got lower percentages of people saying that plant-based imitations are healthy. There's a significant gap between those imitations and perceived healthiness of those versus the much higher percentage that say that those real meat, milk, and eggs are healthy. And even those who purchased those imitations in the past, especially imitation meat, they aren't as likely to purchase them again. In fact, less than half of people who said that they bought imitation meat in the past said that they're even somewhat likely to do that again in the future.
That's a really interesting takeaway there. You know, another thing that stood out for me in this survey were some trends we've been seeing over time. One was a trend that started before COVID, but accelerated at that time, and it's continued. We've asked folks which labels they're looking for on their meat and dairy, and they were provided 17 different options of labels. The top 3 labels that were chosen by the consumers all relate to location and wanting that connection with the local farmer. Those 3 labels were raised by Iowa family farmers, raised locally, and made in the U.S. I think that really ties into what we're seeing across the landscape with the revitalization of local meat lockers, farmers selling through farmers markets, the growth of CSAs, and even e-commerce and other direct-to-consumer marketing efforts. I think consumers really want that connection to the local farmer, and clearly farmers want that connection as well. And I also think that there's a correlation between those strong trust numbers that we saw and the consumer demand for those local products, which is another reason why Iowa Farm Bureau developed programs like Acres of Opportunity and Grow Your Future to tap into these emerging consumer trends to really provide value for members and open up those markets. You know, we've also seen the Iowa Department of Agriculture tap into this trend as well through their Choose Iowa program. And listeners might remember episode 160 back on May 6th when we brought on that program's director, Beth Romer, to talk about Choose Iowa and that unique marketing opportunity to really highlight and celebrate those Iowa-produced products.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's absolutely a reason that those programs exist, and it's because it's building off this trend, these things that consumers are wanting clearly right now from farmers and the avenues that farmers are pursuing.
Yeah, certainly some valuable information there, and appreciate the conversation. So thanks for dropping by, Zach.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And if our listeners want to learn more about the results of this year's Iowa Farm Bureau Food and Farm Index, we've included a link to more information down in the notes for this podcast episode. Now, let's get to the featured interview for this episode, Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johson. Brent's had a busy summer, including Iowa Farm Bureau's Economic Summit in June, County Farm Bureau meetings, traveling to Washington, D.C. to work with lawmakers, and most recently, out at the Iowa State Fair meeting with farmers, lawmakers, and fairgoers. Spokesman editor Tom Block recently caught up with Brent to discuss the state of the ag economy and the urgent need for a new farm bill, an issue that's only becoming more important as the ag economy fights through some mounting challenges.
Brent, we're going to talk about the Farm Bill and some other policy issues here in a minute. But first, I know you've had a busy summer as always. Can you recap some of the things you've been working on this summer on behalf of Farm Bureau?
Yeah, absolutely. It really has been a busy summer. I mean, just thinking back of places I've gone and conversations I've had over the last couple weeks even. Been out to Washington, D.C. We had another AFBF Board of Directors meeting out there. And of course, we talked about the Farm Bill there, so we'll catch up here in a minute. But one of the things that I think is important to recognize is Iowa Farm Bureau specifically is a unique organization. And, every year, one of those measurements is, of course, membership. And the membership side of things on American Farm Bureau, there was actually 2 states recognized this last quarter with membership, one of those being Iowa. And so really proud of the fact that our state's volunteers were so active, and we do have a strong insurance company that really contributes to strengthen membership. And what's really exciting to me, though, is even though we've already met membership goal as far as AFBF goes, since that time, we've also brought in enough members. We're actually going to surpass our navigator status for this year. And it's been a really long time since Iowa has passed navigator status for membership with AFBF. And Navigator's simply just a larger percentage increase rather than just your standard increase. So it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of challenges in agriculture right now. And apparently Farm Bureau is one of those places where people are finding their information and coming to us to be a member, to be a part of an organization that can truly pull some levers and hopefully make a difference for the future of agriculture.
And it's also county annual meeting season, and I know you've been out and about and seen some counties as well.
Yep, trying to make some county meetings. Scheduling is a little bit difficult, but district meetings are underway and ahead of our summer policy conference. And, there's a lot of folks asking questions right now, which is always inviting. And, we certainly encourage our members to partake in that process. And, just making sure that I'm on the road as much as possible, darkening farm driveways, and just getting in front of members and making sure we're hearing what's said. This week's actually State Fair Week, and Secretary Nag and I had a young farmer roundtable at an event. We had young farmers, not only from our organization, but most of the other commodity groups as well. And it was really just an open opportunity for those young farmers to have the ear of Farm Bureau, to have the ear of Secretary Nag, and let us know what challenges are they hearing, what opportunities have they experienced, where do they see this, as a specific demographic. So to take those opportunities wherever they are, I really enjoy making sure that our organization is in tune and primed and ready to have those conversations.
And one of those issues that affects young farmers and all farmers really is the Farm Bill. So We'll turn our attention now to the Farm Bill. Watching the news out of Washington, there's a growing pessimism about the ability to pass a new long-term bill here before the end of the year. What are your thoughts on that? And what is your message to lawmakers on the need for a new Farm Bill?
Yeah, we're really getting to the point where we need to. This is always a serious conversation, but we're actually getting to the point where we've got some real concerns boiling up in the rural communities when it comes to the economic situations. And to have a Farm Bill is one of those pieces that really brings a sense of foundation. And we don't have that right now. We're currently in an extension. The conversations around Washington, D.C. are stalled when it comes to this Farm Bill. And that really puts a sense of insecurity, if you will, when it comes to some of these challenges that people are starting to face. And so our lawmakers, they really need to buckle down and have these conversations. Let's get to work. Let's bring this Farm Bill forward so that we can have some sense of direction and security for the risk protection tools that are in the Farm Bill, the SNAP programs, the cost of food. All of those things are so much more expensive than when the last Farm Bill was passed, and we really need an updated Farm Bill, modernize it for today's situation. And so we're really calling on those lawmakers to get to work. Let's get this hammered out. Let's put this in place.
Yeah, we'll break into some of those little pieces you mentioned with the economic situation and delve into a little bit of food prices here later. But as you mentioned, the economic situation for farmers is a lot different than it was just a year ago when the 1-year extension was passed. And maybe at the time lawmakers thought it was an easy extension. But right now, with crop prices at the lowest point since 2020, how does that play into the Farm Bill status?
Yeah, well, all you got to do, you got to read the news, right? So John Deere's made a lot of news lately with all their layoffs in multiple locations. And Kinsey just most recently laid off 25% of their workforce. That's rippled into Firestone. It's rippled into Gates out of Newton, some of those suppliers for those larger companies. And that all compounds each other. All those problems are going to be a real challenge for rural Iowa and small town Iowa. And then you put together the revenue constraints that are happening on the farm today. You look at the grain charts, those trends are down in a strong way. I mean, here we are today approaching harvest, and our cost of production far exceeds our revenue right now. So we're in an upside down situation, and that's just simply not sustainable. Livestock sectors, we got some hit and miss conversations there. Of course, the hogs have had a really hard time the last few years. Cattle, there's some decent things in cattle right now, but it is still some hit and miss there in that segment as well. And then you've got the poultry and the other folks too. So there's a real sense of urgency when it comes to where we're at, the economic constraints that we're all starting to feel. If this doesn't turn around, if we don't get a farm bill to help us shore up some of these losses, unfortunately, we've got things lined up potentially for a bad scenario. And if anybody knows me, they know that I like to talk on the positive side of an equation, but to be realistic about it, we can't bury our head in the sand on this conversation. This is a real need. The time is getting short and something needs to be done, and it needs to be done very, very soon.
And with the high food prices that you mentioned earlier, it's worth a reminder that most Farm Bill spending actually goes towards those nutrition programs that are also more important than ever. And you've mentioned, this is a Farm Bill very important for farmers, but important for all Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. It's called the Farm Bill, but more realistically, it is a Farm and Food Bill. The SNAP programs, those folks who rely on some assistance when it comes to their protein needs and their sustenance. And under the last couple years, all this extraordinary inflation that everybody has been affected by, those folks who actually need the Farm Bill program, the SNAP programs, are the ones who are suffering the most right now. So to get that modernized, to put these risk management tools in place for production agriculture, to make sure that we continue to have high quality, predictable, sustainable protein sources for all Americans, we're really at a critical juncture right now.
Another thing that you mentioned as you talked about some district meetings that you've had with the Summer Policy Conference coming up, and that's a policy-focused conference, but I'm sure that crop prices and the expected yields will dominate a lot of conversations in the hallways. What's the mood of farmers as you've been out talking to them this summer, and what are you hearing from farmers?
Yeah, I think most farmers that I'm talking to, they certainly recognize the economic challenges. And with that same conversation, there are a lot of really good crops out here. And there certainly are those challenges. I mean, there are those folks who have had way too much rain, where they've been flooded out. There's been tornadoes. There's been farms lost. I mean, granted, those situations are there. But in a broad stroke, the attitudes are okay right now, because primarily we're looking at a decent crop out in the country. We'll see what happens in a month or two when the combines start rolling. We start figuring out where our actual break-evens are going to be when it's coupled up with the production that's out there. But overall, I'm hearing farmers pulling back with purchases, which is reflective of these John Deere type conversations. And so to tighten up their wallets and basically starting that process of hunkering down. And so there's going to be some folks that are going to experience a good year. There are certainly going to be a large number of folks this year that certainly have their challenges with excessive rains. There's devastated crops in northwest Iowa, southern Minnesota, other parts of the Midwest, and those folks who have been struck by tornadoes and hail and all those conversations. I mean, there's going to be some real concerns out there.
Absolutely. And you mentioned hunkering down as farmers get into the fields this fall, already starting to think about next year. Next year looks like even a bigger economic challenge. And a lot of these current economic issues were discussed. IFBF hosted an economic summit earlier this summer in June. What are your reflections on that event? And in particular, I wanted to ask you, you had a one-on-one conversation with Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the economic outlook for next year is tough. I mean, it looks like currently, the cost of production is going to overrun the income. That's going to be a hard situation. And we've been there before. The good managers will figure it out how to turn a profit in that circumstance. And hopefully we get some trade and we can get some of our markets opened up. I mean, this state, this country is one of the few places in the entire globe that we far outproduce ourselves. And so we're really reliant on trade. So hopefully we can get there and we can change some of these conversations moving forward. To come back to the economic summit, President Goolsbee, I really appreciated him taking his time to come to Ankeny and meeting with a few hundred farmers and giving his perspectives. And when he and I were in front of the crowd, and I pressed him a little bit on the economic situation, and to give him credit, he was somewhat aware, but hopefully through this conversation he became a little more acutely aware of the segmentation of the agriculture segment within the economy that he oversees broadly. And hopefully he starts paying attention, because even though he had heard about some of the layoffs, I threw out several others that he wasn't aware of, and he didn't understand what those ripples actually meant for farm gate Iowa, for small town Iowa. And honestly, I think it was a learning experience for him. It was certainly a learning experience for me. Hopefully to continue those conversations with President Goolsbee, so that as they're developing their economic policies, that he can keep the agriculture sector in mind when he's making some of those decisions.
That's why those networks are so important, so you can have those conversations with people maybe outside the agriculture space. Lawmakers from Washington are currently on their summer recess as we speak. Elections aren't far off. What are some of the key issues that farmers should be looking at or asking questions about as they perhaps see candidates at local town halls, or do their research on some of these candidates, not just for those national offices, which are obviously important, but also for those state and county offices that are also crucial to farmers?
There's so many things that are being discussed today. When it comes to production agriculture, some of our members have heard me talk about the concept of social licensing. And it's really, what does society think of agriculture, and what do they grant their graces as to good practices or bad practices? What's their understanding as to why we do what we do? And so to enter that space of understanding that the consumers, the general public, I think they generally want to know. And agriculture, we truly have a fantastic story to tell. And that's something that we should be proud of. And we need to do a better job of saying what we've said. And, there's been a lot of things like, farmers, we're used to talking about efficiencies when it comes to bushels per acre and some of these kinds of things that, is just kind of the normal lingo. But as we start to enter some of these other conversations, carbon intensity scores and, some of these environmental impacts, it's not natural for a farmer to understand how to talk about that. So I've asked some of our team here in the office to do some work, and that's coming along. And so I'm excited to talk about that in the future, to not only take that efficiency conversation, bushels per acre, pounds per animal, whatever it might be, but also translate that in a way that we can have a broader conversation that maybe enters up a new avenue of people that are engaged in this conversation or want to be engaged in this conversation. So to have those conversations then with the future candidates, with the future office holders, I think it's important that agriculture, we continue to tell our story. Because if we don't, somebody else will, right? I mean, that gets said a lot. But this is really a critical point right now. And you go all the way to the top to the presidential elections, and there's a really stark difference between those two candidates. And whether one's better than the other one, we're going to have a challenging conversation in either administration. It's just which challenging conversation are we going to have? And so to understand that, and then to follow the down ballot conversations as well, and try to put those pieces together so that we can have a workable economic opportunity for production agriculture for the state of Iowa, for the Midwest, for the United States.
Thanks, Brent. Of course, all of us working in agriculture are familiar with the economic headwinds we're facing right now. And with the Farm Bill hanging in the balance and elections just around the corner, it's important that decision makers are aware of those conditions as well. Farm Bureau will be there, making those facts known to the folks making decisions that impact your livelihood. And we'd encourage you to be out there telling your farm story right now as well. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you found it helpful and that you'll join us for our next episode on September 9th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.